Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to start a new study today. I've entitled it Righteous Indignation. I think it's something you've heard about. We're going to talk about anger, something you've all experienced. Sometimes we experience righteous indignation, but sometimes we experience self-righteous indignation. Or we could say unrighteous indignation. We're going to talk about all kinds of anger. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we will have to interrupt our study about this topic for 2 consecutive weeks, because next week we're going to have the Mount Ellis Choir. Mount Ellis is our boarding academy here in Montana, and their young people are going to be with us next week, so they're going to be having a concert. And then the week after that, Pastor Chris Barr will be with us, and his message will be different than our theme, but we'll continue talking about anger throughout the month of November after that. So, I think this is a relevant topic. We all get angry, and we all experience other people getting angry at us, right? So we're going to take a look at this topic from the Bible, a biblical perspective on anger. And my subtitle is Rethinking the Universal Problem of Anger. And one of the first misconceptions we're going to try to break is that anger in and of itself is not evil. So I put problem in quotation marks because anger is actually not necessarily the problem. The problem is sinful human beings and how we do anger. Because we're going to find from the Bible that God is an angry God. Now, don't quote me out of context. We're going to unpack that. God is a God that demonstrates, reveals, and experiences anger. And we are created in the image of God. Therefore, we are wired by God to be angry. Of course, this in the context of sin, because in a perfect world, in a perfect universe, God would not be angry, and therefore God's children created in His image would not experience anger. So here are the 3 points or 3 questions that we'll answer today in our study. I hope that you will be blessed. I've been blessed by studying this topic, and I want to thank Sharon for spending a lot of time putting together excellent studies, lessons on this topic. And at the end of our series, we'll make them available to you in written form. So if you feel like, you don't have time to take notes or you don't absorb as well if you're having to take notes, I'm going to share a lot of material, much of which comes from things that we've been studying downstairs in our Sabbath school about the topic of angry for the last few months. But here are the 3 items, 3 topics that we're going to talk about today, or 3 questions that we'll answer. What is anger? Just a simple definition of what it is. I mean, I think we all know what it is, but sometimes it helps to break it down and dissect. What exactly am I experiencing? What's going on when I get angry? How do we experience anger as humans? And then what does Scripture say about anger? This is just an introduction. So we'll start with the first question here. What is anger? I don't think that this needs much explanation. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, pictures are better than words. So I'll just give you a few pictures to help us see anger from different angles. Of course, we are all angry people, though we express it very differently. Of course, we all, or most of us, I think, that drive, we get angry when we're driving, right? There's traffic anger or road anger. And then this is probably the one I struggle with the most, angry at customer service, especially when there's a delay in the flight or you feel like the person just isn't competent to get your problem solved. And a lot of times we find ourselves getting angry at people that really have nothing to do with our problem, nor are they able to fix our problem. But that just shows just how distorted and how unreasonable and uncontrolled our anger is as sinful humans. Of course, I experience this one on a daily basis. Children, especially when it's time to eat your vegetables. Angry children, right? And I think those of you that are parents or have been parents understand what I'm talking about. And I hear it gets worse when they become teenagers. I'm not looking forward to that. And of course, couples experience anger with each other. And a lot of that is leading to divorce and relationships that are being alienated. Of course, parents get angry with their children. And I am one of those, and this is one I struggle with. You know, I used to be the kind of person that would look at parents and watch them struggle with their children, you know, trying to get them to eat their vegetables or whatever it is that parents struggle with. And I used to say, well, that's not going to be me. You know, these parents must not have read the right books, and they must not have really had what it took to be parents. But now that I am a parent, I've found myself definitely to be more humble and more or less self-confident about my parenting skills, because I find myself doing this, what you see here on the screen, a lot. And sometimes I'm ashamed at the things I get angry about. Now, there are some things that parents legitimately should be angry about when they see certain behavior in their children. But then the question is, what are you angry at? And what is motivating your anger? We're going to talk about all of this. And of course, we see anger in the workplace. Bosses angry at their employees, employees angry at their bosses. And this is probably the area where our anger has come to surface more than in any other way today in our society. Social media. And some people say that social media is causing us to be more angry. And in some ways that may be true, but from another way you could look at it, social media is only revealing, exposing just how angry people really are. And Sharon alluded to this in her time of prayer during her little talk on leading up to the intercessory prayer. So a few words to kind of give us, a definition, a working definition of anger: displeasure, rage, irritation, indignation, fury, outrage, exasperation. Here's an old English term. You'll find it in your King James Bible: choler. So what is anger? What is anger? What does it take for anger, whether it be good anger or bad anger, to be experienced? Two things primarily. I mean, we could say more, but I'm just trying to make it very simple. You have, number one, a perceived wrong. You see on the news that a child or children have been abused, and you get angry. Well, before you get angry, you have to see something that you perceive to be wrong, something that's bad, at least you believe to be bad, and you say, this matters, this is important, and you get angry. And this is why we say that anger cannot be in and of itself bad or sinful. Because if you watch the news, if you look at the world around you today, and you don't feel moved with some form of passion and displeasure and dissatisfaction, then there's something wrong with you. Apathy and indifference towards the wrong, towards the evil in the world around us, is a problem. And so anger is not in and of itself bad. And we're going to unpack this in just a moment when we talk about God and Him being angry. But you have two basic elements when anger is on display. You have a perceived wrong and then an expression or a reaction with displeasure. You say, either out loud or within yourself, this is not right. I'm against that. So if you hear about someone that's experiencing abuse or someone that is starving because of someone else and their injustice, maybe you hear about the corruption in government in some country overseas and how that's impacting innocent children, and you say, that's wrong, and you say, this is not right, I'm against that. And you feel angry. That's what anger is. And so, for example, this week, you should have experienced anger if you've been following the news. You have the caravan of people. Now, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, it's not about politics. This is about humanity. Now, you can be angry at the government of countries in Latin America and Central America that in great ways and in a large way is responsible for the suffering of their people. And the drug lords and the crime and the criminals that have caused this human crisis. But no matter who you're angry at, whether it be American government or governments overseas or whoever it is, watching this has to stir you to some form of displeasure. If you look at it and you feel indifferent or apathetic to it, then there's something wrong. Something that then it's a different problem, which we're not going to address in this study, but a problem nonetheless. Now, if you watch this and you feel angry with people, whether it be your president here in the United States, and there are a lot of people who are angry with the president, other people who are angry with the criminals, the bandits from places like Guatemala and Honduras that have contributed to this crisis, you have to start thinking to yourself, Lord, what kind of anger and to whom should this anger, or to what should this anger be directed? What is righteous indignation and what is self-righteous indignation? If you're angry at what's going on, that's not bad in and of itself, but then you have to do some heart searching and say, Lord, what's driving, what's fueling my anger? What do I feel when I read about or see hunger in the world? Or abuse, domestic abuse, right here in our own community, which is very, very common, way too common. What do you feel? So that's anger. It's a feeling after perceiving something to be wrong, a feeling of displeasure, a feeling of discontentment, a feeling of rage. I'm against what's going on here. Okay, so that's anger. So the next part of our talk today, angry manifestation. Now you have to know yourself, and I have to know myself. How do I express or how do I experience anger? Because not everybody does angry the same way. I'm going to tell you about myself in just a moment. Anger can range, it's a broad spectrum of those who experience anger in the world. Anger can range from tepid annoyance to mindless rage. And here are the two main types of anger: internalizing or exploding. And this is an oversimplification. We don't all neatly fit into these two categories. because, as I explain this, I'll tell you about it. Internalizing means repressing feelings of hurt and frustration. You know, you're upset at someone or something, but you don't express it. So people that don't know you very well, that see you on a superficial basis, they wouldn't know it, but there's a lot of anger inside. That's internalizing. And then the exploding. We all know that one, right? Because that's what we usually equate with anger. When we see somebody lose their temper, curse, or even have a violent outburst, like throwing plates and throwing lamps inside the house, it begins with a buildup and then followed by a triggering event. Can be verbal or physical, sometimes even violent. Now, the reason why I say we can't just fit everyone into these two neatly designed categories is because there are people who are internalizing anger in the workplace or in the world, in society at large, but then when they come home, they're exploding, even abusive with their spouse or their children, right? And so you can't necessarily say a person either fits in one or the other. And sometimes angry people are more capable of exploding with people with whom they're most intimate or closest to. But in general, all of us either tend to be internalizing anger, experiencing internalizing anger, or manifesting the exploding form of anger. So for example, you have Jenny and Hank. They seem to have a good marriage. Jen was upbeat and rarely got angry. Hank was a hardworking and caring husband. But Hank's father had been verbally and physically abusive. As a result, Hank was prone to serious depression, even to the point of often becoming suicidal. He was also addicted to pornography. Hank began having several one-night affairs when traveling for work. One day, his conscience torturing him, he confessed all that he had been doing to his wife, Jen. She cried, but she never yelled or got, quote unquote, angry with her husband. 3 days later, they had to rush her to the ER. She was suffering from a severe case of colitis. What do we call this? Internalizing anger. So some personalities don't express it, but it doesn't mean they're not experiencing anger. And so what happens to anger that is internalized? It's suppressed. And you think to yourself, well, I'm not an angry person because I don't curse at people, I don't yell at people, I don't ever lose my temper, my face doesn't turn red in my interaction with those that annoy me. So you say, I'm not an angry person. You actually feel good about yourself. You know what happens when you internalize it and don't deal with it and process it? That attacks organs of your body. And that's why a lot of people today struggle with different types of diseases of that nature. When we talk about anger, we are generally referring to outbursts. Unfortunately, that's just the way we've been conditioned to think about anger, but that's not what anger is limited to. And that's why when we read some stories in the Bible that talk about Jesus being angry, and we're going to talk about some of those, we read into the story what we have seen in others who have lost their temper. Unfortunately, that's the case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus lost his temper or was being driven by uncontrolled fury. However, anger can fester over a lifetime due to unresolved hurt. So even though a person may not be exploding or losing their temper, it may be festering. and it destroys relationships. So, what are the different expressions of anger? Bitterness, complaining, coldness, self-pity. Of course, those that externalize it, explode. You have violence, cursing, yelling, tantrums. Most children, of course, they externalize it unless they are conditioned to internalize it. They're taught that they need to keep it suppressed. That's not healthy, though they may appear on the outside to be good children. Mild irritations aren't as destructive as a violent outburst, but it does slowly destroy relationships and physical health. So with that in mind, we'll just scratch the surface today talking about anger in the Bible. So of course we have God's anger. We're going to talk about this in more detail with more depth in another sermon. But Romans 1:19 says that the wrath or anger of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. So God does experience anger, and when you read the Bible, God's anger is against sin. It's against ungodliness, everything that is not like Him, or unrighteousness, everything that hurts, everything that is destructive to His children and to the well-being of the universe, God hates. That's the picture that the Bible paints for us about God. And in Psalm 7, verse 11, the Bible says, God is a fair judge and a God who has indignation every day. Of course, God is not bound by time like we understand time, but the psalmist is using language we can identify with. It's basically saying that in this context of sin in the universe that has been disrupted and stained by transgression, by rebellion, God feels anger. God is not indifferent to the sufferings and woes of humanity. When you read the life of Jesus, there aren't a lot of cases, but there are especially two. Jesus, of course, was God in the flesh. He was a revelation of God to humanity. And we find two stories in the Bible, in the Gospels, of Jesus being angry. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. So if you want to just look with me in Mark chapter 3, this is a story. Actually, this is the only place where it actually uses the word anger in relationship to Jesus. And we're going to notice here, according to our definition of anger, the anatomy of anger, that there is first a perceived wrong and then a reaction towards that wrong. Mark chapter 3, it's a story, short story here. Mark chapter 3, beginning with verse 1, the Bible says, "And Jesus entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand, a deformed hand." So Jesus sees a person that is suffering under the burden of disease. So Jesus, of course, is moved with compassion, as He often was, as He came across people who were suffering. In verse 2, the Bible says, "And they," this referring to the Pharisees, if you look at the context in chapter 2, "and they watched Him, whether He would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse Him." And of course, Jesus knows what's going on. So Jesus sees the man that's sick, needing help, and He knows that he's being criticized and under scrutiny by those who are not moved with compassion towards the man, but are moved with irritation towards Him because they know that He wants to heal the man. Just so you understand the setting. In verse 3, the Bible says, that Jesus said to the man which had the withered hand, "Stand forth." And he said unto them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill?" But they held their peace. And when he had looked round about on them, if you're following with me, you can fill in the blank. With what? With anger. So, was Jesus angry? Jesus was angry. Why was Jesus angry? What is the perceived wrong? What does Jesus see that's wrong here? What's that? Hardness of heart. That's what the Bible says, isn't it? He was angry because of the hardness of their hearts. Now, I do appreciate that it doesn't say that he's angry at them. You see that? Now, he is angry because of the way they're behaving. Now, the perceived wrong is you have a man that's sick in need of help, and you have a group of people who are not moved with compassion. They're not moved with pity towards the sick person. And Jesus is angry because of injustice. He's angry because of unrighteousness. He's angry because of unfairness. And the Bible says, he said to the man with the withered hand, "Stretch forth your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. Verse 6, the Bible says, "And the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him." And the Bible says in verse 7 that Jesus withdrew himself with his disciples to the sea. So you notice Jesus is angry. He does what he has to do, and then he withdraws. And we're going to talk about that in a future study. But the point here is, Jesus was angry with the Pharisees because of their insensitivity to the man with the withered hand. He's angry because of injustice. He's angry because of sin and the pain that it causes to humanity. That's God's anger. That's what it looks like. And then on another occasion, Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 to 13 here. We can look at it real quick. Another occasion, it doesn't use the word anger, but you can just read it and you can tell that Jesus is stirred. He is indignant. He's upset. Nothing wrong, then, with being upset. Nothing wrong with being angry. Nothing wrong with being indignant over a situation. The question simply is, what's driving it? What's driving it? And what are you doing about it? What reaction is it causing? Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. "And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them, the money changers, that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said to them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." So Jesus was angry with the merchants because they were misrepresenting God's character. He was angry because they had turned religion into merchandise. They had turned religion into money-making schemes. So again, he's angry at a situation. He's not angry at them, but because of the way they're behaving and what that is doing in terms of its effect upon others and upon God and His image in society at large, he's angry. So when you read about what happened during the Middle Ages with the selling of indulgences, if you read about it and you see how people were led to believe that they could purchase with money that was actually being used to help a few people live extravagantly, to purchase the love and favor of God. When you read about religion and Christianity during the Dark Ages, if it doesn't make you angry, then there's something wrong with you because of what it does to the character of God. And when you look at Europe today and you see the post-secular, post-modern reality of Europe, they're beyond religion, mostly atheistic, very, very little faith in God, even of those who still profess some form of Christianity. Instead of being angry at people who may appear in your eyes to be rejecting God, what you should really be angry at is the abuse of religion that took place for centuries that led to society rejecting God. That's what should drive your anger. Don't be angry at people because God knows the context. You don't know why they behave the way they do. You don't know why they are the way they are. God knows. You look at an atheist today and you say, how could these people, don't be angry at atheists. Be angry at what has probably been the most contributing factor to the proliferation of atheism in the world today, which is a misrepresentation of God's character, which is exactly what was fueling Jesus' anger here in Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. And so Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, be angry. Doesn't say don't be angry. It says be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. So this is what we will be unpacking in the next few weeks as we study this. How can we be angry and not sin? How can we experience righteous indignation rather than self-righteous indignation? God wired humans with the capacity to react with displeasure toward injustice and to act forcefully to make wrongs right. Anger can be a powerful agent for positive change. It was because of righteous anger that slavery was abolished. It was because of righteous anger that segregation was done away with in this country. It was because of righteous anger that positive change has taken place in this world. In many ways, good Christian, good godly people who have been stirred, been dissatisfied with the status quo. But when walking in the flesh, human anger is destructive.